Watch this.
You know, normally what goes on at a convention can rarely sustain 2 days of coverage. But what happened this past weekend in Twin Falls has us continuing the conversation. After all, it was the state GOP convention, and it is Idaho. So 13 resolutions were passed, ideas Republicans would like to see become rules going forward. And they touched on everything during the convention, from no support for any abortion to unequivocal support for Israel. Well, we touched on one of these resolutions yesterday, the crossover voting resolution put forth by Brandon Durst. The idea was to clamp down on people signing up to vote Republican who aren't really Republican, like Democrats crossing over just to have a say in the Republican primary election. To limit that from happening, Durst believes a voter should not qualify as a Republican if they join the party less than a year before the next primary election held in an even-numbered year, or they removed themselves from the Republican rolls at any time in the past 2 years, if they donated to more than one candidate of a different political party within 2 years of the primary, if you were a member of any other political party within those 2 years, or voted in a primary or caucus for any other political party over that same time span. These rules would not apply to new voters, by the way. The reason for these new requirements, or what the majority of those delegates believe was happening, was the infiltration of the Republican primary this past May. The number of registered Republicans jumped this past spring. As we can show you here, back in January, there were about 531,000 registered Republicans in Idaho. Democrats accounted for 134,000 across the state, unaffiliated about 310,000. Then along came the idea of Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeehan for governor, Priscilla Giddings for lieutenant governor, Dorothy Moon jumping into the race for Secretary of State, Raul Labrador for AG, and even Brandon Durst running for statewide offices on the Republican ticket. And by April, just 2 weeks after the deadline to switch parties, that number of registered Republicans went up by about 15,000 voters. But the Democrats only dropped by about 5,000, which means most of them were jumping in from the unaffiliated side of the pool, where that number dropped by about 7,000. A bigger influx of Republicans happened between April and July, which means we have to believe they registered day of on that primary or anytime after, to the tune of 31,000 new Republicans and 28,000 fewer unaffiliated voters. So is it crossover or just joining? It was a complaint made by Brandon Durst almost immediately after he lost his primary bid to be the next state superintendent of public instruction. He lost because of the votes of the not real Republicans, which is why in just his second Republican convention, he spearheaded this plan to make it more difficult to participate in the Republican primary. His idea got a lot of support, he says, because he's not the only one who thinks it's a problem.
The problem is that those who do not share the values of the Republican Party, as espoused by its platform, are choosing to vote in the Republican primaries, and with the intention of nominating candidates that don't reflect their Republican platform. And I look at it like a team, like a sports team. You don't want the other coach picking your quarterback. You want your coach picking the quarterback. And the same is true in a political party. I mean, it's a club, it's a group. You know, they have defined rights to say who's in the group and who isn't.
So are you basing on the fact that a lot of people joined the Republican Party prior to the May primary?
And I don't think it's just those people that joined. I mean, there are those that have been around for times beyond just that. There are those that have affiliated as Republicans for many election cycles who do so not because they share the values of the Republican Party, but because they want to interject their own values into the Republican Party that are antithetical to the Republican Party, but then they go vote for Democrats in the general election. And I think that's really the test, because then it just demonstrates that they weren't really acting in good faith. They were doing something to try to mitigate what they consider probably their own losses in terms of an ideological disposition. But I don't think that serves the Republican Party well, and I think most other Republicans feel the same way, and that's why we made this change.
But in a state like Idaho, where we have nearly 1 million registered voters, and as of July, 525,000 are registered Republicans. Mm-hmm. It is a Republican-dominated state.
Yep.
So if they want their voice to be heard, they feel maybe that they should be able to have a say in who runs as a Republican, because we all know if there's an R by the name in Idaho, chances are you're going to get elected.
That's true, and I don't blame them for having that opinion or that feeling. But I think what's missing is the perspective of the party, which is, again, it's an organization that has a constitutional right to decide who associates it with and who it associates with and who associates with it. right? And so that's where the disconnect is at. This isn't an election. This is a nomination process. This is how we pick who's going to be on our team, who's going to represent Team Red. It'd be no more fair to have them have a voice in that process as it is for the U of I to have a decision on who starts at quarterback for Boise State.
Are you worried about alienating voters because you're setting up such a strict process when it comes to registering and voting in primaries?
I really don't think that the requirements are actually all that strict. It's no secret that I was a Democrat.
Right.
I would have been eligible to vote in this last primary. I would have been eligible to vote in the prior primary. What we want is we want committed Republicans participating in our process. That's what we want. We're not even going to put a litmus test on ideologically what part of the party they're in.
I was going to say, because it sounds like that's what it is. It sounds like you have to believe this and this only.
Yeah, see, and that's why the rule doesn't speak to where they at. We don't actually say, you have to sign some oath that says, yes, I agree with all these parts of the party platform. We're not having that requirement.
Okay, so the direction the party's going now could be seen as alienating to some moderates.
It could.
And you will lose registered voters.
That's possible.
You're okay with that?
Yep.
Why is that?
Because I think that at the end of the day, the question is, why do we do what we do in May? We do it to nominate who's going to represent the Republican brand. How do we know what the Republican brand is? Well, the only metric we really have for that, or the only way we really measure that, is through our party platform and the adherence to that platform.
How do you feel about the direction of the Republican Party after this weekend?
I love it. I mean, I'm going to be really honest. I think it's great. I think it's exactly.
You don't feel it's like extreme?
No.
Why not?
Because I think it's all depending upon where you sit as to how you see perspective of things, right? But ultimately, I think that the party is moving towards what I believe the Republican Party really should stand for.
You've just elected a chairperson that doesn't believe the 2020 election was legitimate. Mm-hmm. You're okay with that?
That's what the assembled wisdom of the convention said they wanted. And who would I be to disagree with that?
If it's not true.
If what's not true?
The presidential election of 2020, do you believe that it was legitimate?
I think that we had an election process that was flawed. Were there improprieties? There were imperfections? Yes, there absolutely were.
Even though none of that's been proven?
They absolutely have been proven.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. We know, for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, they were not requiring the statutory requirement that people sign their affidavits for their absentee ballots. They were dispensing with that requirement and still counting those ballots anyways.
Wasn't that accepted by the court? It
was. It was accepted by the by the state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania.
So therefore it's legal.
Well, that's a matter of judicial interpretation. I would say that those things are still illegal. The court just permitted them to exist.
I guess that is the gist of all this, is this idea of freedom, yet we want to set up all of these rules. Whether it's from who can vote in the primary to whether or not a woman has rights over her own body. Mm-hmm. And you're okay with the way that is going right now as a former Democrat?
Yeah, I am. As someone who's switched parties, I maybe have a level of appreciation that others don't. I'm not going to apologize for believing that an unborn baby deserves to live. I'm not going to apologize for believing that Republicans should have the right to decide who their quarterback is, who they nominate for different offices to represent them in a general election. Those are the right things that we should be doing. And frankly, it's incumbent upon the other side of the aisle to be doing their part too. Because that's how we live. That's the kind of republic that we're supposed to be. And we're supposed to have, a marketplace of ideas that are competing.
Okay, so as for who's going to track and police this possible policy, Durst said it would come from data already archived by the Secretary of State's office, even those moving in from out of state. So it'd be a small burden in both process and paying for it. But any extra cost should be covered by the party, Durst says. Worth pointing out, by the way, these platforms that will guide the direction of the party for more than 500,000 Idahoans were decided by 750 people this past weekend, each of them handpicked by each county's central committee. And these are not, they are just resolutions. They're not rules. But there's nothing to say that it won't be brought up and introduced as possible bills the upcoming legislative session.